So this is really a quite emotional day for me. There were many seasons in the writing of this book when it really looked like it would never see the light of day. There were publishers who said it was too long or not the right sort of book or didn't really agree with what I was trying to do with it. There were other publishers who wanted to chop it up and dismember it beyond all recognition. And so as we gather here today with the book actually published, I can't really help but think back to the fresh-faced undergraduate that I was, all those many, many years ago now, here, when it first dawned on me that this was the sort of book that I might want to write. It came really out of a sense of frustration. Frustration of living in two disconnected worlds. The first world was the world of my studies. I did French and German. It was a very literature and philosophy heavy degree. So every week we'd be thrown a new thinker to try and digest and spit an essay out about in about a week's time. And I remember in particular one unit that I took as an undergraduate. It's my favorite unit during my whole time here, called Modern Critical Theory. And each week we'd have a new theoretical approach to digest. There was a week on feminism, there was a week on post-colonialism, I think, the week on Derrida, week on Foucault, Deleuze, and week on Marx, and so forth. And as we churned through these different theoretical approaches, it seemed that they were all performing similar sorts of moves. And what they were all doing, in their very different ways, was they were all making certain things in the world visible to us, like drawing our attention to certain things. Pay attention to this, look at this, be sensitive to this. You know, whether this is the oppression of women in society or power relations in society. And they were all teaching us what's valuable in the world. Care about this, praise this, privilege this, and also condemn these other things. So they were all making certain things in the world visible and certain things valuable. And for the longest time, really, that was the working understanding of a critical theory that I received from this unit. Now, of course, today, the dominant sense of a critical theory is probably not that one. It's a narrower understanding that comes from the Frankfurt school of early 20th century German thinkers, Theodor Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, and so forth, who were very loosely trying to take Marxism and to generate a theory of culture out of that particular way of looking at the world. And even narrower than that today, I think if we were to go down to the street and say to people, what do you think critical theory is? A lot of people would respond in terms of critical race theory, CRT, that is often in the news for various different reasons today. But I do want to insist on the broader sense of critical theory, I think. And I fear that there's a risk of that broader idea getting lost in the focus that there is on critical race theory today. Because if we just focus in on this narrow, sort of quite recent development, we sort of frame ourselves, if you like, as a SWAT team, parachuting in to a culture to deal with a particular local problem, namely critical race theory, and then to be airlifted out afterwards. And I think the danger with that is that we lose the ability to actually understand critical race theory itself in the ecosystem of theoretical approaches in which it's grown up and developed. And we think that the only way in which critical theories impact society is in this very local way. And I'd love us to see ourselves more, if you like, as a police force ranging over the whole of the social and political landscape, trying to get a sense of the way that theoretical approaches are manifesting more globally. And I do have a sense that there's a danger of that being lost with a narrow focus on critical race theory. So when I'm using the terminology of critical theory today, I'm mainly meaning this broader canvas of theoretical post-Kantian approaches to understanding and critiquing society. So that was the first world in which I was moving as an undergraduate, but there was also a second world, which was the world of my church and of my Christian union. And this was a world that took the Bible seriously, that read the Bible slowly, and that wanted to apply the Bible to the whole of life. And as week after week in church on a Sunday morning, in small groups, in Christian graduate society, Bible studies, we would pore over God's word and try and understand it better. It sort of struck me that among the different things that the Bible is doing, it is also performing these theoretical gestures. Now, it's obviously not the main thing the Bible is doing. The Bible is making us wise for salvation through faith in Jesus Christ. But also, it is making certain things in the world visible to us. Pay attention to this. Notice, for example, the glory of God in creation. The heavens declare the glory of God. It may never have struck us before we read that psalm, to look out at the heavens and to think that. But the Bible says, notice this. And the Bible might draw our attention, for example, to the plight of widows and orphans in society. Be sensitive to this. Notice this. This is visible for you. And the Bible is also making certain things in the world valuable to us. For example, the value of serving other people as Christ did. It may not be something that we'd have particularly prized before reading the Bible, but it says, no, this is really important. Serving people is really valuable. And so the Bible is performing in its own way these same moves that the theoretical approaches that I was studying were performing as well. But there wasn't really a place in my life, I guess, at that time where these two very different theoretical approaches could come together. There was no place where you could sort of hold Rousseau in one hand and the book of Romans in the other and say, well, let's talk about it then. You know, what is society? What is a human being? What is life? What is this world that we're living in? The closest, I think, was the Round Church Library at the time, filled with books of Christians trying to sort of bring these different worlds together. And I guess that was the frustration, and that was the original impetus for wanting to write the book. How do we get these different approaches talking to each other? How can the Bible speak into the issues that are being raised in this theoretical discourse? What fresh perspectives can the Bible bring to these different debates that are going on? But I had no idea how on earth to write that sort of book or to do that sort of thinking. And then two things happened. Two pennies dropped, if you like, to help me understand what that might look like. The first was that I got hooked on Bible overviews. I remember the first Bible overview that I ever did. It was a summer camp that I was a junior leader on. And it was so hard to describe and to encapsulate the electrifying excitement of that first Bible overview. But it really was like walking into a different world and realizing that the Bible is not just a collection of very important stories, and it's not just the history of a nation either. The Bible, from its first page to its last, is a complex, multi-layered, rich, and yet coherent story in and through which we can live, that makes sense of the whole of reality for us in a specific way, makes sense of us as human beings. And I was really struggling to try and find an image to capture that, and this is the best that I've got. It's like if you'd sort of grown up thinking that the epitome of musical achievement was a toddler banging a pan with a wooden spoon, arrhythmically, again and again and again and again, and I do, I'm afraid, speak from experience, and thinking that is as good as music gets. And then being given a ticket to hear a professional orchestra perform a piece of brilliant music in a symphony hall, and suddenly realizing that the world has got suddenly richer, deeper, more complex, more exciting. And that's what it felt like, to realize that the Bible was unfolding this story of reality that engaged with and made sense of so much of the world. So that was the first penny that dropped. The second one was that I stumbled into reading Augustine's City of God. I say stumbled into because I had it with me one holiday on the East Yorkshire coast. We went to the lovely seaside town of Bridlington with my family. And I don't remember distinctly, but I suspect it rained all week. It usually did. It's a fair bet. And so there was lots of time for reading. So I ploughed through this brick of a book that I had some sort of sense was important, but really didn't know why it was important in the history of Christian thought. And two things from that first reading. The first was I really didn't understand most of it at all. All the names, all the Roman heroes, Roman gods just went right over my head. But the second thing that I remember from that first reading is that the bits that I did understand were absolutely electrifying. Because what Augustine is doing in that book is he's taking this Bible overview structure. So in the second half of the book, he just goes through from creation to new creation. He tells the story of the Bible. But he's using that as a series of lenses through which to critique the entirety of late Roman society. You know, it's religion, it's civic life, it's games, everything. And he's able to deploy this Bible overview structure in a nuanced, incisive, rich cultural critique. And I guess I was so beguiled by that approach that I wanted to try and hold a little candle to the blazing sun of Augustine and use that model to try and engage late modern culture. Now, if I had to try and sum up the approach of the book quickly, as I've been invited to do in this talk, I guess I'd hit two notes. And they're two things that I think, two ways in which the Bible repeatedly engages with modern and contemporary culture. And two things that I try to do in the book over and over again. The first I, in the book, label diagonalization. But the label's not the important thing. The label simply makes visible something that I think is going on in cultural critique. And so I'm not particularly sort of wedded to the idea of diagonalization. It's the thing that it labels that I'm really excited about. Let me try and explain what that is through an example. So, in Genesis 1, we have the idea of the image of God, don't we? And there's a wonderful harmony in this idea of the image of God between two, what you might call, dynamics. So there's a great dignity afforded to human beings. There's a worth in being in the image of God. Nothing else in the whole of creation is in the image of God. Not a beautiful sunset, not the Milky Way, not a school of whales, not the roaring ocean. Only human beings, the whole created order, are in the image of God. It's a huge dignity. But there's also, in the image of God, a humbling of human beings, precisely because we are in the image of God. We're not God. We're not top dog in the universe. That place is reserved for God alone, and we are in his image. And there's no sense, is there, in the image of God idea that those things are in tension, that you've got to split the difference between dignity and humbling. There's a beautiful harmony between them. But if we look at the way in which anthropology unfolds itself in modern Western thinking, one way of understanding it, I think, is what we find is that these two elements of the image of God, the dignity and the humbling, are, if you like, dismembered from each other, ripped apart, and opposed to each other in a rather ungainly way. So one way that the modern world conjures with anthropology is that it considers us to be nothing more than either animals or nothing more than machines. And it's really evident at the dawn of modern thought in Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, this sort of foundational text of modern political thinking, and he just comes straight out with it in the first chapter, and he says, we are strings and springs and wheels. That is who we are. We're machines. And other people have argued that there's no qualitative difference between humans and other animals. But also, the modern world exalts the human being to the point of deifying us. And this is John Milbank's argument in the opening chapters of Theology and Social Theory. And the way that he puts it is that we take the image of the voluntarist God, the God of people like Descartes, for whom that nothing stands in the way of their will. And Descartes is really extreme about this. He says, if God wants 2 and 2 to make 11, he can. Nothing can stand in the way of his will, not even logic. So we take that voluntarist idea of God, and Milbank says, through Thomas Hobbes and others, that becomes the image of the human will and of human power. And so the modern world sees humans as exerting this untrammeled will. I can make reality, including myself, in my own image. Nothing stands in my way. I'm a voluntarist God. Now, the problem is when you have both of those anthropologies circulating in society together. So society effectively says to us, you're a machine. Oh, and by the way, you're a god as well. Go figure. Psychologically, that is a really hard position. I think that should evoke pathos from Christians. That's a really agonizing tension to live in. And what it means to diagonalize an opposition like that is to say, wait a minute, both of these elements are, if you like, dismembered limbs of a richer, harmonious biblical whole. There's a sense in which human beings are humbled, and there's a sense in which human beings are exalted. But they go together beautifully in the image of God. And so to diagonalize this opposition between we're animals and we're gods is to say, well, look at the rich biblical picture that precedes this very awkward and agonizing distinction. Let's not start from this opposition. We don't have to choose between are we really animals or are we really gods, one or the other. No. There's a biblical reality that they're both partial corruptions of. And therefore, I'm not convinced that the language of the third way that's often used to describe this move is terribly helpful, because the third way gives you the impression that, okay, well, there's animals over here and there's gods over here. Let's split the difference and meet in the middle. Let's say that we're half animals and we're half gods. And then everybody's happy. Everybody's got a little bit of their position reflected in the biblical position. But it isn't that, is it? The image of God is not we are half machines and half voluntarist gods. No, the image of God precedes this false dichotomy. And so I wonder whether it might be more useful to call it a first way rather than a third way. The rich biblical truth is original, and it's the modern world that's corrupted and dismembered it. And what we need to do is reclaim the original biblical truth rather than split the difference in some sort of cardigan and slippers wearing way. Sort of everybody should be happy. Let's just give everybody a seat at the table. That's often the way in which the third way is characterized. So that's the first approach that the book tries to take, the idea of diagonalization. The second thing that I do often in the book, I think has been named best by Dan Strange, who is coming to speak here in a few months. He calls it subversive fulfillment, after the Dutch missiologist J.H. Bavinck, who uses that language. And I think the best example of it, actually, is in the first chapter of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where he's engaging two dominant cultural values of his age. If you remember, he says, Jews demand miraculous signs, and Greeks seek wisdom. And later on in the passage, it's clear that the miraculous signs are to do with power. The Jews want a manifestation of power. So he identifies that these are two things that people really value in society. There's wisdom and there's miraculous signs. And then Paul brilliantly does two things. And I think it's the combination of the two that's genius. So first of all, he draws a thick, hard antithesis between what the Jews and the Greeks want and the cross of Christ. If you remember, he says, Jews look for miraculous signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, foolishness to the Greeks and weakness to the Jews. So this is the absolute opposite of what you think you want. You seek wisdom in a man dying a criminal's death on a cross, you see only foolishness. And the word there that he uses is a word that's akin to moronic. This is stupid. The cross is stupid to people who want wisdom. And you people who look for power, what could be weaker than a man unable to move his limbs, gasping for breath, dying on a cross? So there's an absolute antithesis between these cultural values and the cross. But he then goes on a few verses later to show how this same cross is the fulfillment of what the Jews and the Greeks are searching for. So, for example, he says, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. So there's a scale of wisdom. It's impossible to compare Greek wisdom to God's foolishness. And if you do that, you see that there's more wisdom in God's foolishness. The foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. And at that point, it's as if he's issuing a challenge to the Greeks. If you're really serious, you Greeks, about searching for the wisdom you profess to desire, are you willing to search for it in the place you would least ever think of finding it? On the foolishness of a man dying on a cross. Because if you are willing to get over yourselves and look for it there, you will find a wisdom, the riches and the depth of which you've never imagined. You will find the fullness of what you seek. And the brilliance of the passage is that the fulfillment doesn't water down the antithesis, and the antithesis doesn't compromise the fulfillment. The cross of Christ is still foolish to the Greeks. He's not saying, if you keep going a little bit further, dear Greeks, in the way that you're going, you'll find the cross. You're almost there. No, he says the opposite of that. It's foolishness. You need to turn around 180 degrees. But if you do, you will find everything that you're looking for and more in a transformed, transfigured way. And I think that's a very helpful paradigm for us in our cultural critique today, because I wonder if you agree with me that there's a tendency to sort of gravitate in cultural criticism to one of those two poles. So you've got your antithesis people who say we must make it clear that the gospel is not just a warmed over version of the culture. That there's clear blue water between the gospel of Christ and what the culture is saying. And we can't mix the two up at the risk of losing the gospel. And then there's your fulfillment people over here who say, yes, but the things that the culture wants are corrupted versions of things that are to be found in Christ. And we just need to point people to him to find the fulfillment of what they're looking for. And the tragedy of that situation is that the antithesis people throw stones at the fulfillment people, saying, you're compromising with the culture, you don't understand the uniqueness of Christ, you've drunk the late modern Kool-Aid. And the fulfillment people throw stones at the antithesis people, saying, you're utterly irrelevant. There's no point of contact at all between what you're saying and the culture. And to use the words of George Whitefield, I think what we might want to say into that position is put up your swords. Like, this is not the right battle to be having. And Paul shows us the way in which you can unload both barrels on antithesis and be all out on fulfillment in a way that but doesn't put those two in tension with each other. And so I think this 1 Corinthians 1 model is incredibly helpful and energizing and powerful for Christians. I try to use it again and again in the book. So now that the book is out, let me just finish by summarizing what I hope, by God's grace, it might contribute to achieving. First of all, I hope that it might be a factor in some Christians coming to find a way of inhabiting late modern culture and politics in a richly biblical way. And I think this is one of the great questions, one of the great challenges facing the church today. When I was here as an undergraduate, the thing that really got Christians hot under the collar, the reason that Christians divided, was primarily the question of charismatic gifts and their status today. I don't know about you, but that debate feels really old to me now. And what divides Christians today, it appears, on Twitter and elsewhere, is questions of how individual Christians and how the church should relate to the secular culture and to politics. And there are a bewildering range of options, aren't there? We've thrown lots of different paradigms. You remember in 2017 we had Rod Dreher and his Benedict option, suggesting that, among other things, Christians need to withdraw from society and create thick Christian communities separated from the broader society. And then there's this book that's just been out recently talking about Christian nationalism. And it seems that Christians are being enjoined somehow to take the reins of power. And by what means it's slightly unclear, and to try and diffuse Christian values throughout society in that way. I'm hoping that the book might help people to feel their way into a Pauline, a Petrine, exilic paradigm, and the paradigm that Augustine is unfolding in the City of God as well, which I think is deeply biblical, as a way of inhabiting late modern culture that perhaps avoids some of the problems that Christians are encountering as we relate to culture today. My second hope and prayer for the book is that it might help Christians to be a little bit more on the front foot publicly, in the public square. You know, we can be forgiven, can't we, at the moment, for thinking that the only time Christians ever appear in the news is when they're being beaten over the head with some sort of stick for either what we believe or something that we've done. And often those sticks are worth it when Christians have behaved despicably. But it's a shame, isn't it, when the only time Christians get a voice is when they're being attacked and pilloried for something. It's obviously a shame for Christians, but I wonder if I might make so bold as to say that it's also something of a shame for the wider society, because the Bible does have a distinctive voice and distinctive contributions to make to these big political and social issues that we're facing. And if that voice is lost or excluded from the conversation, then the whole complex society loses something from its debate. And I'm hoping that this book might help some Christians to find a vocabulary and to find a posture for being, humbly and respectfully on the front foot, casting a positive vision for what society can look like and can be, using biblical principles, bringing biblical ideas to bear on the public debate as a voice in that conversation. And the third and final thing that I hope and pray this book may achieve is that there may be just one or two fresh-faced undergraduates out there who, like me, all those many years ago, are trying to make sense of the frustration of living in two separate worlds, and for whom this book might bring a little more quickly the realization that it took me many years to come to, which is that indeed there is such a thing as a biblical critical theory. Thank you.